Welcome, everyone. This is the Global Afrobeat Live Talk Show. And my name is Denise Abdul-Rahman with the Chisholm Legacy Project. We have had some phenomenal programs. This will be our third one. We are here in Sharm el-Sheik, Egypt. We're attending the Conference of Parties 27. Where a lot of negotiations are going on, talking about the reduction of climate, talking about loss and damage. And some of us are talking about race and climate reparations and how to really be supportive to our communities. So we're just beating that drum. The other night we had Reverend Malcolm from Alabama and Sawatu from Detroit and Melina from Liberia or Zimbabwe, I'm sorry. And we just continue to have this global and important conversation. And tonight we are so honored to have Ruth Santiago with us. She resides in Puerto Rico or does a lot about her work in Puerto Rico. So we're so happy to have her. And I'm going to have Ruth go ahead and share some things about herself and then we can get into some questions. So happy to have you here, Ruth.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you in your Afrobeat program, and congratulations for starting this initiative. As you mentioned, I am from Puerto Rico. I live in Salinas in southeastern Puerto Rico, which is one of the coastal areas. As you probably know, in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico, the coastal areas were usually where the people of African descent were brought to work on sugarcane plantations and that kind of thing. And to some extent, right, that has remained a pattern. And so in Salinas, southeastern PR, where I live, we have a large Afro-Descendent population. As in so many other places in the Americas, right, we are overburdened by contamination, by pollution. We have the two most contaminating power plants in Puerto Rico, sited in one in Salinas, one in Guayama, which is right next door, and just a concentration of contaminating activities that are overburdening our communities. And at the same time, of course, having a total lack of health services, education, employment opportunities. It's the classic environmental injustice situation. And so my work is around, is with multiple community and environmental groups to achieve, especially now we're concentrating on energy justice and the radical transformation of the electric system that we need in PR.
Thank you so much for that wonderful grounding, Ruth. And so I will pivot to some of the questions that we have for tonight. And in respect to, your community and maybe what has brought you to COP27, an aspect of what has brought you to COP27, what have you heard while you've been at COP? What kind of sessions did you attend? What kind of intel can you share with us?
Yeah, okay, so I wanted to say, just generally speaking, that this whole process, the COP process, is very much a reflection of our societies and the social injustice. And so what we're seeing is that the groups like the new Climate Justice Pavilion that was just formed is an attempt to carve out space for our communities and our people, right? And the African diaspora. So I loved when we started yesterday with the topic of the African diaspora and especially the focus on Afro-Descendant women. Today I was able to participate in a
Looks like we've temporarily lost sound from Ruth. We will give her a moment to come back.
And how
Ruth, we weren't able to hear.
Mining.
We lost Ruth. So hopefully Ruth will be able to rejoin us. I will share, I guess, a little bit maybe of what she was. Oh, great. So we have, looks like Philip from Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance popping in. So we'll just give him one moment. And I think in the meantime, I'll kind of put out to the audience as
right now.
I'm going to put out to the audience that as we are live streaming, and if you have thoughts, you have questions, you have comments, please put them in the chat, because this is our global collective coming together, trying to get the solutions, trying to figure out ways that we can stop our bad and bring in the good. We want to welcome Philip. Thank you, Philip, for being here. Ruth was just sharing with us some of her experience on what she had listened and heard about at the COP27. We want to give her the opportunity to finish her thoughts, and then we will introduce you here, Philip. So thank you for making time. Ruth, are you able to talk?
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. So I was saying that one of the panels that I attended today was about the open pit mining in Colombia, and how the Afro-Descendent and Wayu indigenous communities are impacted in every way in terms of their water is taken away from them. They many times don't have running water in their homes because the mining takes up so much of the water. Their rivers are the courses of the river are changed, mining activity, etc. Many impacts. And so that coal then is exported to places like Puerto Rico and burned in, for example, in the community of Guayama, which is the neighboring municipality in southeastern Puerto Rico where I live. I live in Salinas, and that coal is burned, and the coal ash waste is used for years was being used as fill material over construction sites, over the only source of drinking water that we have in Salinas, right? So 100% of our drinking water comes from the ground, the aquifer, and the coal ash waste was being placed in like 40 different places on top of the aquifer. And of course, the heavy metals in the coal ash waste now are leaching into our water supply, right? And then not only that, after the company did even before, they were using the coal ash waste to fill construction sites in southeastern PR, they were taking part of that coal to Afro-Descendent communities, the coal ash waste to Afro-Descendent communities in the Dominican Republic. And then all of a sudden, children were being born with birth defects, and people were having all kinds of ailments that they didn't have before. And so there were, lawsuits brought, and the AES power plant, AES Corporation actually settled for millions of dollars those lawsuits related to its coal ash waste. So those are the kinds of things that I work
on. Thank you, Ruth. And those are some of the sessions that you saw some commonality in the plight in Puerto Rico and in some of these COP27 sessions that you were in. Was there some other session that you'd want to lift up in specific or conversations that you were having with others around this similar issue and showing how systemic it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I find that at these conferences is that many times in Puerto Rico, we don't have access to high-level U.S. officials, whereas many of them are here. And for example, today I had a meeting with someone that we've been trying to get to in Puerto Rico, and we're not able to get that kind of meeting, but that person was accessible here. So that's another thing. This is an international conference, but in the case of Puerto Rico, because we have such little access, to the federal government and to those high-level officials, this is a more sort of conducive environment for that. And so I had a meeting this afternoon with someone to discuss the issues in Puerto Rico as well.
Thank you for that. And I don't know who your high-level federal official was, but I heard there was a Secretary Kerry sighting today. So I'm sure some folks from U.S., possibly the territory of Puerto Rico were able to access him, hopefully. So Philip,
well, I did.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I did at the U.S. Center. I did hear part of his talk, but it didn't touch on Puerto Rico. And actually, it was interesting experience because somebody was protesting him because they were claiming that he was proposing false solutions. So I happened to be there when that happened.
Wow. Thank you for that. And that's some great intel for the folks that aren't able to be here with us right now. So that's part of what, this global Afro beat is all about. We want to beat the alarm. We want to send out the messages and share all the knowledge that we're all gaining and experiencing, those of us that are able to participate here. And we want to take the message from you if you're listening to us on the live stream. So, make your comments, what you would want us to be telling these, high level officials or these negotiators. So this is all of us together. So now I want to make some space for Philip. We're so glad you were able to make it. Can you share who you are, where you're from, and something about your community, however you define it? And then we'd like to just ask you, what did you hear about at the COP27 today? What sessions were you in? So if you can address all of those questions, appreciate it.
Great, and thanks for the opportunity. And this is quite an exciting segment. And I never knew it occurs at this hour, but I think I'm more than impressed to really join you. I come from Kenya, and I come from a farming community in the pastoral, in the agro-pastoral zones, basically the arid and semi-arid areas of Kenya. But out of my work, I've been able to largely interface with Africa, so I can actually speak like as if Africa is my village. But I want to pick on a trail of thought that is quite important based on what I heard today from the sessions that were occurring. I think by virtue of my role being heavily coordination, I'm usually less privileged to attend many sessions. But today I was actually privileged to attend a ministerial session, which was actually looking at the new quantified goal on issues of climate finance. And it was quite a deep reflection and deep perspectives. But what I heard, which is quite useful, is that the colonization of Africa will continue through climate change. Indeed, climate change provides another wave of colonization, and now global capital is actually descending on Africa to colonize Africa. Indeed, the climate opportunities that we saw to develop and revolutionize Africa is not apparent, because again, developed countries that were responsible, who are responsible for the emission and who indeed need to provide the much needed funding, are not necessarily willing to give it in a form that constitutes reparation and that constitutes duty of care. Indeed, they are seeing business opportunity. And when you look at the waves of extraction activities that have taken place in Africa, that will continue. It is about our land and how do you make the land available? How do you make water available so that water becomes a commodity to be traded in from an adaptation perspective to make programs much more feasible and commercially feasible and viable. It is about our agriculture will be dispossessed from our hands and be assigned to foreign capital for purposes of really pushing a narrative that we do not understand, and for purposes of making money available. It is more of, again, our minerals again being extracted to support the transition to the new to the new agricultural and to the new economic order, and also provide transitional minerals that are found in Africa. And it is indeed about foreign capital colonizing nearly each and every sector, including the energy sector. So you begin to see that playing right at the back. I think I picked on the statements from the US president and the representative of US, John Kelly, Ambassador John Kelly, and I also picked on other sentiments from representatives from quite some powerful countries. The import of that was simple, that we have capital. Money is not lacking to respond to climate change, but money is averse to realities of the current vulnerabilities of the continent. And therefore, the incentives that are there for capital, for money to flow into Africa, for the climate funding to flow in Africa, is for Africa to bend backwards and avail those investment opportunities for foreign capital. Indeed, for me, it is now a colonization of massive scale of our economic sector, our financial sector, and our policies have to be amended to really accommodate this flow that is so needed. So these are the things that I'm really picking from this conversation, which sends serious shockwaves in terms of how heavily we can be colonized if it goes beyond political to economic and to social. But then again, beginning to call upon us to begin to reflect deeply in terms of how best as Afro-Descendants we can actually mobilize our capital, put it in place, and begin to control some certain critical sector. I think even as we do that, we must push back on the narrative. And we have the space to push back on the narrative, looking at how best we can actually improve efficiencies within our governments and functionalities to deliver what is necessary. Thanks.
Wow, thank you for that powerful message and sharing with us. Can you maybe it's reiterating, but I didn't exactly hear you say what about the talks did you hear that said that this colonialism was still alive and well, or maybe if you could put it in layman terms. And then what you said that the type of capital that was being recommended for some form of climate reparations was inadequate. Can you share what kinds of forms of capital you think would be more just and equitable and actual reparations that apparently these talks are not proposing?
Great, and thanks, and sorry for that particular omission. I think clearly there were a number of countries and ministers from a number of countries rightfully pushing for public investments in climate change, and that Africa needs public investments in form of grants, in form of concessional grants, not loans. And indeed, essentially, it was quite clear that even if we are going to invite private capital to private investments to be quite key in this transitional process, again, their role is limited in particular context. But again, there was quite a strong persuasion that the private capital must not only be incentivized, and whatever that means, but more importantly, it should be de-risked. The incentivizing and de-risking basically means that more public resources are actually going to be spent to really create a fertile ecosystem for the private capital to private investments to be real within climate change. The implications of investing in a continent such as Africa and other less developed countries, private funding, particularly for climate change, is that it worsens the vulnerabilities of the people. It worsens first and foremost the debt portfolio, which is at the all point I at this particular time. But beyond worsening the debt level, it makes the economies of local African countries unable to provide basic services. And if you look at the context of Africa, basic services is so key, and governments do require resources to provide these basic services to meet quite immediate needs, and that is already suppressed. When you look at the context again within Africa, we are having quite a number of countries spending between 5 to 15% of their GDP on responding to issues of climate change. That is massive spending, and that means a lot of resources are already being moved away from providing basic services to really look at how best to respond to humanitarian crises that are caused by climate change. And therefore, that means that the kind of money that we do require as climate investments from the global north ideally should be funding that is public in character, not private investments. But we need to look at how the world is structured and what is happening and begin looking at the conspiracy. The conspiracy is that within the UNFCCC, they created a mechanism that is again disconnected from the accountability that was expected under Paris Agreement. And that is where the problem is, because the moment you create GCF, and then the GCF itself begins to mobilize resources from all quarters under different conditionalities, and then automatically begins to convert itself into a sort of a bank, and then begins to expect funding that it's giving out to be leveraged. You create a mammoth of challenges, a mammoth of problems, and we cannot resolve it. But therefore, we are saying moving forward, we have to push back on the multilateralism that constitute UNFCCC to do things right in terms of funding for climate change remains centrally within the public realm, particularly when you look at adaptation issues of losses and damages, and particularly in reaching communities that are at the front line. Earlier, I forgot to mention that we had also quite an interesting session that was also spearheaded by PACCHA, which was actually trying to create the link between the grassroots communities and providers of finances. That session happened in the Resilience Hub, and the conversation was quite interesting because the providers of finance kept insisting on capacity building as a cost cutting. And I think I stepped in on a point of intervention to say that we have to reverse the order. Reversing the order means that we must do things differently. If the financial providers think that the communities have no capacity, then that is a misnomer, because the communities are trying to grapple with the challenge of adaptation. So we are saying, let's first change the narrative that one, the communities have capacity. It is the providers of the finances who have not understood the community. So let's invest capacities in the providers of the finance so that they are able to set mechanisms and put in place financial mechanisms that resonate to the competences of communities, because that is a missing element. Thanks.
Thank you for that very informed and intelligent information sharing for us here. And I really want to encourage, if you're listening to us on the live stream, this is our chance to listen and learn, and to also contribute our Black genius together into this space. And definitely, a lot of the countries that contribute the least are most direly impacted by climate change and incurring all this debt that they didn't even create the problem. And so why should they have to get a loan to like rebuild their infrastructure after, you know, some major hurricane, or the creating water systems because of drought conditions, all caused by the climate changing. So there definitely should be some kind of, to Philip's point, some kind of public investment, grants and things of that nature, from my understanding, or from what I'm trying to listen and learn. And Ruth, to you, I'm sure there's so many correlations as it relates to Puerto Rico and the battle that's going on there. What are your thoughts around some of what Philip has lifted up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think everyone knows that Puerto Rico's debt situation is being restructured, supposedly, and the bond market and the bond insurance companies and the vulture funds want to extract blood, basically, from Puerto Rico. And especially with respect to the electric company debt, which is about $9 billion. So they wanted, there was a recent proposal by the bondholders to charge us an extra fee of $26 per month to pay, just to pay the debt. And that's in addition to the fact that Puerto Rico already has the second highest electric rate of any jurisdiction within the United States. And sometimes it's even higher, the highest. So this economic oppression that we're seeing, it falls heavily on people of color, in not only in outside the U.S., but even within the United States, in the case of Puerto Rico and other places where people of color are located and don't have the opportunity to really challenge and put up resistance to these companies and these investors.
Thank you so much for that, Ruth. And I want to put up the question, you know, what would you want the people to know, the people in your in the Afro diaspora, to know about your experience so far? So if you both can kind of think about that, and then in the meantime, I'm going to lift up, it looks like an Erica Holloman Heel said 5 to 10% of the GNP on climate change impacts. Wow. The connection between the financial systems and climate justice must be addressed. Can you speak in detail of how the AU is thinking about the cost of climate change impacts on the continent? So if either one of you want to answer Erica's question, and then we can pivot to, you know, what would you want the people in our Afro diaspora to know about your experience so far?
Probably I can take it quite upfront, and then my colleague can also weigh in at one point. And I'll say yes, Africa Union does indeed take climate change seriously. And as we speak today, the launch of the Africa Union Climate Change Strategy, Climate Change Response and Resilience Building Strategy of 2022 to 2032 is going on, and it has quite useful pillars that again reinforce the response to climate change. But basically, statistics that you've just quoted, I'll call them preliminary statistics. They might, and they highly focus on sectors that you can easily quantify. from an economic point of view. Indeed, climate change is also causing other non-quantifiable damages. For instance, how do you quantify the loss of life of somebody, and how do you quantify loss of a culture? How do you quantify displacement of a community? So there are quite a number of other losses that are occurring that so far there is no clear quantifying mechanism that are in place, and indeed is where economic implication is apparent that quantification does indeed happen. So indeed, that could be a serious understatement of the implication of climate change on gross domestic product. But more broadly, then we need to look at climate change in perspective, in terms of what will happen in a very near future. We are sort of seeing and witnessing across Africa regions that are increasingly becoming uninhabitable, and therefore communities are migrating. So climate mobility is indeed becoming quite a reality within Africa. And within the discourse of climate mobility, what we are also seeing is that communities are now moving into territories of other communities, and that has far-reaching ramification in terms of worsening the existing precarious security, security context within the continent, because again we have pockets of insecurities. So climate change is actually playing on those pockets of insecurity, broadening the frontiers of insecurity, but also worsening the existing insecurities. Indeed, when you look at the water, because the underlying factor under climate change is water, then you begin to see much more areas of Africa becoming quite arid, and therefore pushing communities away from those areas to areas that add marginal agricultural potential, and the pastoralists and crop producers coming into conflict, and that is worsening in many pockets. On the flip side, then climate change is playing in context of much water. And much water means much more flooding, and that much more flooding is also making areas that communities use to grow their vegetables, their crops, again, unavailable for that production. And in some certain instances, then we are having strong winds, which are eroding coastal cities and coastal seas with much more implications. So quantifying that overally will be huge. And there are implications on infrastructure across, which is unquantified. Indeed, when I look at then the waves and the episodes of climate-triggered crises that are occurring within the continent, I'm left a bit grappling on what the magnitude will look like. Like look at Nigeria, 34 out of I think 40 or so 50 cities, states in Nigeria being under city. That is massive destruction, both on the infrastructure and the income and the livelihood opportunities for the communities. When you look at Chad, I think Chad has now been consistently underwater for the last almost 3 to 4 weeks, counting. And that challenge is not going away. When I look at a country that never witnessed any climate-related disasters, such as Uganda, and in Uganda we had massive flooding occurring in one period, and even the dead were not spared. We could see graves being excavated by the floods that were occurring in Uganda. So you begin to see the extent of the damage is much more massive. Countries that were not initially candidates of climate crisis are now falling into that end. And therefore it means Africa must, even as we look at the cost, begin to look at how best to overhaul the structure, to adjust the structure, the structures, the infrastructures, to be able to accommodate new realities, new emergencies, and new phenomenon. Will that be, from a development perspective, looked at as climate investment? Largely no. Because developed countries will look at that as part of normal development. So there are elements of responses that development world will look at as part of normal responses, and therefore they will not necessarily look at them from a climate perspective. And therefore, even though it is going to suck on resources that are within the government, the developed countries are hell-bent in terms of ensuring that these become now new frontiers of investment and bringing their capital to bear. So that speaks to the difficulties that are there. Coming to then what we do expect is a contribution of the Afro-Descendants in other places and in other spaces is, number one, I think we have much more opportunities. I don't think we've crystallized on the opportunities that are presented by us. We know quite a significant number of our diasporas in the UK, in the US, they are actually running and controlling the education sector. The education sector, whether it's in high school, whether it's in universities, whether it's in colleges, institutions of learning, those become quite pivotal centers for really advancing our politics and our narratives. And I think our duty is cut out. We are more than available really to connect, to complete the dotted lines in terms of connecting realities within Africa and what then the young generation in developed countries need to be alive to, even as they influence their policies. I think that's the first thing that is clearly cut out in terms of our responsibility. They also belong to quite a wide range of affiliations and associations, and therefore those then become platforms and fulcrums of influence, which we need not lose sight of even as we engage. And then basically it's also looking at then the investments from the diaspora. How can that then play within the context of Africa? So that again, we are not necessarily saying let's work to get foreign aid flowing, but we sort of work with governments in Africa to create mechanisms through which investments by descendants of Africa, wherever they are, become a reality and play a critical role within the context of Africa. I once developed a development outlook for a small area in a place called Mandera, Takaba. And when I went there to work with the communities and develop their visions, I was not convinced because the children who were in school at that particular time told me that they want to see their city, their small town, not cities, their small town lit with electricity. And they wanted to see tarmac. And they wanted to see water. Actually, water was rated like 3 times as topmost priority. When I was trying to compile the ideas, I wanted to take the idea of electricity, the idea of roads out, because I felt like that is quite too remote, quite distant. But down the line, as we began looking at then who are the diasporas from that area, and how can the diasporas play a very critical role, we mapped the element of investments around infrastructure to spur the growth of the small town. And that has led to transformation, with the town being marked as an hub for administration and commercial activity within the region over time. And now the community also have a decentralized grid. So the point that I'm trying to raise is that indeed, visioning together with the descendants from Africa, from all over, it is indeed possible to fashion investment opportunities that not only transfer real value to their communities, but also enable them contribute to their development, while again strengthening their retirement. And a number of them are also writers, good writers. We need to see how do we then collaborate to amplify these narratives across. Let me pause there. Thanks.
Once again, that's beautiful sharing that you provided. All of what I heard, some of the extractivism and how all of these calamities are causing a lot of climate migration. I've coined the term, I think, Black migration, across the globe, but certainly in the continent of Africa. And then how we, create our own demonstration models or to create this regenerative economy, the just transition framework that we operate off of here at the Chisholm Legacy Project that was created by the Our Power campaign. But in any case, Ruth, would you want to weigh in on that, or would you want to talk about, what progress do you think we have made or that you have made in Puerto Rico?
Okay, so, actually, I wanted to start with the issue of the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. So I think most people are aware that in September of 2017, Puerto Rico was struck by Hurricane Maria, right through the middle, came in through the southeast and went right across and exited through the northwest. And so in the process, it took down our centralized electric grid, right? And we were months and months, some people close to a year, without power, as the previous speaker just mentioned, right? So most people know that even led to loss of lives, right? At least 3,000, there's different estimates, but 3,000 to 4,600 or so people died as a result of the power outage, many because of lack of electric power to, for example, power, life-saving nebulizers or electrical or respirators, or be able to get certain treatments that are powered, right, by electricity. And so what we saw was a terrible or lack of response from, for example, FEMA at that moment. And then 5 years later, we get another hurricane just a couple of months ago, right? Struck by another hurricane, Fiona. But it was a different situation in the sense that it was only a Category 1 hurricane, and it came in only through the southwest, but yet it took down the whole electric system again. And the groups that I work with, both in southeastern Puerto Rico, as well as throughout Puerto Rico, and including community, environmental, labor, academic, professional, we have all come together, and we've been promoting for years, right? A radical transformation of our electric system. And now it's been formalized in something it's a civil society proposal called We Want Sun, in Spanish, Queremos Sol, and basically calls for a redesign of the system, right? There's a historic amount of FEMA disaster recovery funding, the largest public assistance allocation of funds in FEMA's history for the electric system in Puerto Rico. And this coalition that I mentioned, even the workers, the union that it represents the PREPA electrical workers, right? The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority workers are part of this coalition, and we're all working for that transformation that's desperately needed in Puerto Rico to save lives. And it's basically, it's much more complex, of course, but it's basically centered on what is known as distributed renewable energy that is mostly in the form of rooftop solar, coupled with battery energy storage systems and different programs like energy efficiency, demand response, energy literacy, right? We are advocating for not only a technological transformation, but also a governance transformation with our public utility in order to incorporate the voices in the decision-making of local communities that are most impacted, as I mentioned, especially in southeastern Puerto Rico, where the big power plants, the two most polluting power plants are located. And also in southwestern Puerto Rico, there are two more and some in the northern area. To incorporate in the governance the voices and the active participation of communities and different sectors in labor and academics, our faculty members at the University of Puerto Rico, and in that way actually respond to the public interest in Puerto Rico. But in addition to that, we've been promoting this to both the government of Puerto Rico and to the federal government. And I think if anything, if this last hurricane we had that, as I mentioned, resulted in a total power outage in Puerto Rico again just 2 months ago, if there's a silver lining to it, it's that now I think there's much more willingness to listen to our proposal and to think about, and we're hoping that especially the Biden administration, with that funding for disaster recovery, will channel those funds towards a decentralized system, a decentralized, not only decarbonized, but decentralized and decolonized system. We don't have oil or gas or methane or coal in Puerto Rico. We have the sun, and we have a lot of rooftops. And the studies that our faculty at the University of Puerto Rico and others have done, even DOE, indicate that our fastest and best and most viable route towards that transformation is through rooftop solar and battery energy storage systems. So I think that to the extent that the government, both in Puerto Rico and the federal government, actually listen to these overburdened communities and different sectors, just pretty much there's huge social acceptance in Puerto Rico for that kind of proposal. And in fact, high income people in Puerto Rico, right, which are not many, but there are about 60,000 households that have been able to afford their own rooftop solar systems with batteries. But we have 3.1 million people in Puerto Rico, and the majority are living under the poverty rate, either low or medium income. And so we need that public funding. That's the kind of investment we need. The public funding that's already been allocated for the electric system, the disaster recovery monies, to provide that kind of equity, access, energy access, and energy justice to low and middle income residents of Puerto Rico and small businesses. And so that we don't end up with a separate and unequal electric system, which is how we're headed right now. Because as I mentioned, only high income people can afford to finance or to outright purchase these rooftop solar installations. And they have resilience, but the rest of the population does not. The majority of people do not. And so that's why we need FEMA and the Biden administration to make the right kinds, the use of the federal funds that really would break with the business as usual, rebuild the same centralized grid and fossil fired system that we have now.
Thank you so much for that, Ruth. And I, strongly concur. And I think we're big proponents of energy democracy, community-owned solar, for the people, by the people, all the jobs and everything that come with that, resiliency, and possibly even moving a little bit of equity. And I'd be remiss to not lift up that we just released a report called Who Holds the Power, and Demystifying and Democratizing Public Utility Commissions. And so everyone can access that now. Just really want to lift up that we have started a global Afro-Descendent climate justice collaborative that has like over 42 organizations across the country, in various countries across the globe. And we have about 170 attendees, where goal is 200 or beyond, and over 50 different countries. So we welcome everyone to join us. This is a global collective space. We also really wanted to ask everyone on the live stream, if you were here, what would you ask at the COP27? How can we that are here be your conduit for your thoughts, for your Black genius? We have about 2 minutes, so if anyone on the live stream wants to post a quick question, we encourage you to do that. Also want to lift up that we have a resolution that's about to be launched, that has been launched, called Race, Racism, and Climate Reparations. We want to ask everyone's organization to sign on to that. We sent out a mass email, follow our social media the Chisholm Legacy Project on Twitter if you want to sign up, or go to our website, thechisholmlegacyproject.org. And then just as our closing remarks for both of you, how explicit do you think race and racism should be within the UNFCCC? And I know we just have a short amount of time, but in your closing remarks, how would you respond to that?
So yeah, I think what we're seeing is that our communities, our Afro-Descendent people are coming together. I think for the first time, I haven't been to that many COPs, but that this is the first time I'm told that we're having more access to the space, at least to the side events. And so I think that obviously needs to continue, because we all know that environmental racism is a global phenomenon that needs to be overcome.
Thank you, Ruth. And I also ask you, we have a question from Cassandra that says, how can we be supportive to Ruth and Philip's work? So do you want to respond from your perspective? What can people do to support in any way?
Sure. If you're in the state, internationally, if anyone wants to look at the proposal, it's queremossolpr.com. It's a .com, but it's a .org. That was just a glitch. But so look at the proposal, endorse it if you can, and if you're in the States, contact your congressperson. If you have opportunities, we can give you more information. And also it's on site to support the use of disaster recovery funds to go towards a more resilient system and not rebuild the same vulnerable system that we have in Puerto Rico.
Thank you. And Philip, how can we have race and racism be explicit in the UNFCCC? And is there anything that folks can do to support PACJA or your community within the African continent?
Thank you for your question. I think when I look at racism in context of UNFCCC, I'll point to 3 to 4 things. I think the first is about setting the agenda. Who sets the agenda, and how is the agenda defined? When we say the northern countries, the developed countries, owe a duty to Africa, then it is not working until when that duty of responsibility, when the liability element is struck off. And we've seen that particularly in COP27, because under COP27, we had deep and serious agitation for loss and damage to be a central agenda. That agenda was only accepted with a rider that the issue of liability will not surface. But how do you speak about climate justice without liability, without accountability, without responsibility? Because that is where, again, you begin to see racism beginning to take center stage. And where, again, agendas for discussion are first and foremost predetermined, premeditated, and settled, cool and clear. So that's the first element that you actually see. The second element that you see is, of course, substantively the agenda that was struck off COP27 discussion, which is the consideration of Africa being a special needs and special circumstance region. Yet again, within Paris Agreement, that recognition is quite explicit, and it's an underlying principle of all negotiations that again enable Africa issues which are unique, the vulnerability of the continent to be at the core of the conversations. How do you then speak about that? When the third element that you see again, racism beginning to play is the dragging of the agenda. People are not keen to commit, and there is a lot of discussions about nothing. I'll call them discussions about nothing. While again, it is all clear that Africa as a continent is warming to almost 2 times faster than the other parts. Actually, it's usually 1.5 times faster than other parts of the world. So when we talk about the Earth's temperatures hitting almost 1.5 degrees, Africa will be close to 2.5, 2.7 degrees Celsius. So it's warming faster. It's much more affected, it's much more vulnerable as a result of increase in global temperature, but nobody is actually giving that the agenda attention that is deserved. Why? Because it's African who are dying, it's African who are losing their livelihood, it's Africans who are becoming poor. So that is racism at its best. Be it that then that is not sufficient, then you begin to look at how many people are dying out of floods, out of drought that they did not cause. And you begin to see whether even within this COP27 process, we began with a minute of silence or even 5 minutes of silence or whichever period of silence in commemoration of those people who lost their lives as a result of climate-triggered disaster. There was nothing to that regard. If it was one disaster that struck a country in the north and we were actually convening there for a conversation, probably we'll have stood, we'll have had 2 minutes of silence in observing the lives that have been lost. We have seen nothing of that. That is still racism. Let's look at the resources that we are looking at and the funding that we are looking for, particularly from the north. You'll find basically there is a serious history, and I don't want to use word rape because rape sometimes is strong for women, but there has been a consistent trend of Africa being stripped of its resources, and the resources have been invested in the north. They've created wealth in the north. So it's basically a request around whether the north can, in part, as part of reparation, begin to look at how best do you bring Africa to the center of the conversation and begin to do the right thing, which is basically return a portion of their wealth to help them support and deal with the challenge around climate change. Now, there are African countries that are being pushed to become like the solutions for the world. And when I say solutions for the world, is that they are expected not to industrialize, and therefore spare their right to use the atmospheric space and entitlement so that the Western countries can continue with their lifestyle without cutting on their emission. How do you call that? That is racism, because essentially it means my grandmother, my mother will continue to live in a village unleashed because somebody in Europe must continue to live in their lifestyle. That is racism at its best, and it needs to be seen within such a context if we are framing racism within this particular context. So it's important indeed we look at all these elements in totality so that we don't lose on some certain elements. We are having currently a kind of strife. I think today John Kerry was quite clear in his statement. He's basically said US is actually supporting Egypt to transition to renewable, hoping that, again, Egypt at the same time will make its gas available to European countries. What is that? So you are forcing Egypt sort of to take a loan, to take a kind of concessional grant and investment from US to develop the renewable to free the gas for Europe. What is that? Essentially, because essentially these are the things that we need to speak about. But I think coming then to what kind of collaboration support we do expect across as Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. The first is solidarity, being able to speak, being able to know that there is somebody listening at the back and being able to know something can do something small. I think that is great. The platform of Afro-Descendants provides a very critical space for the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance in terms of bouncing off ideas, bouncing off collaborations, bouncing off networks and these networks can open spaces. But I think moving forward, what we need to see is using all the descendants of Africa, wherever they are, in the global north, to convene very powerful conversation, powerful spaces that begin to transform the thinking of the citizenry in the north in terms of driving much more inclusive global development process. But within Africa, we still have battles here home, which we have to fight in terms of ensuring that our policy leaders are up to speed in terms of the resolutions that need to be done, and being able to convene country level, regional, and Pan-African processes. And these are areas that will definitely invite your collaboration, both in terms of our ideas and in kind support, just to ensure that we are able to crystallize and drive that influence to scale. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we're going to conclude the Global Afrobeat. I've totally been evoked. So many things that you've said, you know, just so resonates. And I'm so, you know, really sick and tired of being sick and tired of the same, you know, racist systems that are so prevalent across the globe, concentrated in the African continent. And yes, we're trying to move our communities so that they can thrive. I send love to your, you know, ancestors to be able to have access to, you know, basic right of the basic right to energy, the right to be cool in the, you know, hot time of the day, to that right to be able to read and have light. And we want to say thank you to Ruth Santiago, who has to jump off to another meeting. Thank you for dropping in. And we thank you so much, Philip, for coming in and sharing, both of you, your powerful voices and narrative. And I just want to give at least a symbolic minute of silence for the people that are dying from this climate tragedy, this racism, this premeditated, this taking us off of the agenda, and us having to fight for every aspect of justice. So I mean, you can come off screen, Ruth. You can go ahead. You can do your 1 minute in your private space, but I want to keep it on just for 1 minute as symbolic for those that have died in this racist climate calamity. We're done dying. This concludes the Global Afro Beat.